Oh, cool.
Hello.
Hi, Lavina.
Hi, Lavina.
Well, we're very pleased to start the Montague Barker Lecture Series for the academic year 2022-2023. And starting off with Dr. Usha Reifsnider. She is a British Gujarati Christ follower from a Hindu background. She and her husband, Matt, have served in foreign missions since 1988. Their ministry emphasis has been on migrants, refugees, and diaspora. Usha holds a PhD from University of Middlesex, MTH from the University of Chester. Usha's academic focus is within the intersection of cultural anthropology and practical theology. Her completed PhD at OCMS was titled Reclaiming British Gujarati Hindu Culture After Conversion to Evangelical Christianity. Usha serves as one of the two regional directors of Lausanne Europe and as a director of the Center for Missionaries from the Majority World. And with that, we turn it over to Usha. So please go ahead.
Thanks very much. First of all, I just want to say thank you. There's a number of people that are attending the lecture, and I don't know that they're regular attenders, but I especially want to thank one of my mentees, Tresenia September, who is in South Africa. I had the pleasure of meeting her some years ago when she was at All Nations Christian College. Also, thank you, Peter Oyogi, who is also one of the directors from the Center of Missionaries from the Majority World, and of course, our wonderful faculty, students, also I see some friends from All Nations Christian College. So I feel highly honored, a little bit intimidated, but that's all good. So I'm going to share with you for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then when I finish the presentation, I'm guessing, Tom, that we're open to take some questions.
Yeah, there'll be comments and questions.
Great.
So yeah.
Great. So I'm just going to start off with the reason for this lecture series. This preliminary lecture is a part of a series of 4 lectures to begin with that will contribute towards chapters in a book entitled Unmuted, which I plan to publish at the end of 2023. The purpose of the book is to provide an opportunity to engage with those whose experiences, ministries, and interactions within the Western Evangelical Christian community continue to be restrained by dominant power processes. It all sounds a bit scary, but I think by using these sort of terms, it opens up the discussion and gives us an opportunity to interact with these things. So in writing these books from specific perspectives between, within, and amongst those whose voices are generally secondary, I hope there will be a shift within evangelical Western Christian engagement, an expression at various levels of practice, training, leadership, and education. I desire to involve those who are willing to engage with and examine their position and acceptance of possible inappropriate or imbalanced or a variety of levels of engagement in leadership. I hope my writing inspires those whose voices seem to have been considered irrelevant, inappropriate, uncomfortable, and perhaps even unchristian in the way that they express themselves. By doing so, I anticipate that the challenges of representations within the evangelical Christian community might consider an application of the metaphor of iron sharpening iron. So with that, I will begin with my slide presentation. Right. So muted group theory, what is it to be muted? Muting is a silencing. It's a social behavior with the understanding that in society there are dominant groups and subordinate groups. And the dominant group is not necessarily the majority. So mutedness isn't simply not being able to speak or not being able to be heard. It's also about not being able to express yourself. So what happens in that process is quite important if we have a desire to see the Western evangelical Christian thought be expanded and grow to be more inclusive. So muted group theory is a way to analyze the interaction between the people groups. And it was devised by Edwin and Shirley Ardner in the 70s on their studies on feminism. And what they found during this time is that as women entered the workforce, in order for them to work alongside men, they had to use the kind of terminology and behavior that the men were comfortable with. And oftentimes that meant that they were subject to sexist remarks, ridicule, strange rituals, harassment, and a sort of control. The type of things that today we would consider highly inappropriate, but in the 70s were not. And interestingly, Shirley Ardner is in her 90s now and lives just literally a few minutes walk down from OCMS. She's 98 years old, and she's often seen walking up and down Walton Street. And I had the pleasure of meeting her a few years ago when I gave a talk at Lady Margaret Hall. So she's still around, and she's seen a lot of change, obviously. So anyway, to continue. So how does muted group theory works? So sometimes the way that the dominant power, the dominant language is expressed is through preferred terminology. So we often when we're talking about male and female in a group, we're talking about his ideas, or instead of their ideas or her ideas. And so there's this idea that this particular pronoun becomes the prevalent terminology. So it kind of makes for an inadvertent reinforcing of power. So what happens is subordinate groups, which in the case of feminism that the Ardners were describing, is that the women come second. So we say things like men and women instead of women and men. You can say, well, that's not important. But actually, in the big scheme of things, there's a gradual of the woman being secondary. So there are different ways that you might see muted group theory working. And just because you're muted in one group doesn't mean that you're necessarily muted in every group. So muted group theory isn't something that you're always stuck in, though it can be. So how does muted group theory work? So we talked about the terminology, we talked about models of communication, but the models of communication are not necessarily just in the way that we speak. They could be in the way that we dress. For example, women, if you look at newscasters on television, men always wear a suit coat and a tie, and women are expected to dress in very dresses that enhance specific parts of their figure that is preferable to men. So even in that, there's a dominance. Even though the woman may be powerful, she may be the primary anchor in sharing the news. These things can be seen, and we accept them as part of society. And when I see these newscasters, I don't automatically assume that's me being muted. I accept it as that's the way it should be done. So there's a restraint and a minimization of a subordinate group. And these are acceptable, part of our cultural values. So muted group theory developed beyond just feminism to articulation of women by men. For example, many anthropologists would study women in society, but they expressed the ideas of women in their own terms. And so the women's expressions, when they read about themselves believing what men were saying about them, accepting that, because it's better that than not being expressed or understood at all. Mark Orb, an American, used muted group theory in a little bit of a different way, and similar to Stuart Hall's identity of position and representation. And what Mark Orb said is that it depends on where you're standing, in what position you are, in the way that you might have dominance or you might be subordinate. So, for example, right now, in this room, I have dominant power. I have dominant power. I'm the speaker. I've got control of the computer. All of your microphones are muted. All of your microphones are muted because it's my voice that's important in this room, in this particular group at this time. So that's standpoint theory. It depends on where you are, who you are. Oftentimes in position and representation, I found this a lot in Egypt. When I would get onto a tube in Cairo, there was a woman's carriage. And all of these women, when they're in a woman's carriage, would speak freely and discuss all sorts of things. But the minute they get out of the tube and they're out in society, it's silent. So muted group theory, muting occurs in different times, in different places, and in different ways. Now, Weston Turner, let me go back to Mears, Mary Mears and the others. They talk about 3 types of muting. There are muted people who are engaged. So I could see myself as a muted person engaged. For example, as a woman from an ethnic minority culture, as a first-generation convert from Hinduism, I'm here in a Christian location. I could be muted, but at the moment I'm engaged. Actually, I'm not muted at the moment, but one could see, or in a place like OCMS, I remember during my first RIS, when I sat in this room with 10 other men, how muted I felt. I was engaged because I was part of the program, but I was still somewhat muted. And that actually came out in how I progressed with my studies as well. There's also angrily disengaged. These are people who are muted. They know they're muted, but it's not worth putting up the fight. They just put up with it. And sadly, I believe we see that a lot in Christian expression, in Western Christian expression, because there are different aspects of the Bible that we use to keep other people muted. And so sometimes people could be angrily disengaged. So they're upset about it. And then there are those that just say, you know what, that's the way it is, que sera, sera, whatever will be. And those are the people who are completely disengaged and really are only living a fraction of their potential, in my opinion. So Weston Turner in 2017 said that the worldviews, the perpetuation of power, and the modifications of unique experiences and ideas are exchanged for acceptance. So whereas you might have a minority person want to talk about other things, just because they want to be accepted, they will put up with a lot of stuff. And then I first engaged with muted group theory in my thesis by reading about Linda Lee Smith Bachman, who used muted group theory in her thesis at Fuller University. And she talked about dominance, acceptance, and subordination. And with that, I was able to use muted group theory and make the link with evangelical Christianity. Now, in this explanation of evangelical Christianity, I want you to know that this is a very basic model. I understand that the ideas of evangelical Christianity and what evangelical Christianity is far more than this. But for the purpose of this lecture, I will use Bebington's quadrilateral, which is just a model that really is quite broad and accepted and common in most expressions of evangelical Christianity. That is that Christianity, evangelical Christianity, is based on these 4 corners, if you like, these 4 aspects, these 4 angles. Those are biblicism, in that evangelical Christianity is founded on the Bible, that reading the Bible is an essential expression of evangelical Christianity. Another important aspect is crucicentrism. So looking at the cross and the purpose of the cross is essential in our understanding of evangelical Christianity. Another aspect that other types of Christianity perhaps don't have is conversionism. That an actual conversion experience is very important in the expression of evangelical Christianity, and also activism. So once you are converted, once you understand the Bible, accept that the Bible is the inspired word of God, and that the cross is crucial to your salvation, and then you become converted. You've changed from whatever you believed before to becoming a follower of Jesus dependent on Christcentrism and biblicism is activism. So once you become a Christian, you have a responsibility to do something with your Christianity. It's not just for your personal salvation, but you have a role in the propagation of evangelical Christianity. So while this is very basic, and for the broad variety of people that we have here, they could say, no, it's more of this and less of that. For the purpose of this conversation, we're just going to leave it there for now. So I now want to talk about Christian conversion and muting. And the reason I'm going in this direction is that where my thesis came into connection with muted group theory, I had two specific ideas from Pierre Bourdieu and Michel de Certeau. And in analyzing my research specifically with Christianity in mind, I found that muted group theory went really well. And I think you will see how Western terminology, even when Christianity is translated into the local language, still the way that it's expressed is very much in a Western context. I'll give you one example of that, a very simple example. I often hear people talk about what worship will be like in heaven. And one of the wonderful things that missionaries like to do is to translate songs from English into a variety of different languages. And one of the famous ones I hear, the recent ones, is that when we get to heaven, we will hear Chris Tomlin's "How Great Is Our God" sang in Japanese and English and Arabic and Spanish, and how wonderful that will sound. But my question is this, is that Western music is based on an octave. Now, for Indian people, in between each of those 8 notes, we hear 24 others. So does that mean that my experience of worship in heaven is going to be limited to the Western octave? And of course, the answer is no. So it's not just going to include the Indian range of tones and notes, but also the African and the Arab and any other people group, which is why the idea of every tribe, tongue, and nation is part of being unmuted as an evangelical Christian. Another aspect of conversion is the discontinuation of cultural tradition of dress and celebration of events based on the dominant group's interpretation of Bebington's quadrilateral. By that, I mean that as a person, me as an individual, I came from Hinduism to Christianity. And when I converted, the idea was that there was a particular way to dress in the evangelical church, in the Western evangelical church. And sometimes it simply is such a thing as if I wore traditional Indian clothes, it might be just removing the bindi, which for a Gujarati woman is a sign that she's married. And when a Western church says, oh, in order for you to be a part of our evangelical Christian group here, you must remove the symbol, because it's a symbol that we consider to be demonic. We've translated what that symbol is. And many Christians in India have accepted this as right and proper, whereas those of us from a Hindu background question that. Is that really a part of my salvation? So often also there's the disassociation for the convert from anything that the church does not see as visible in their context. So with that, I will go to my thesis. And my thesis was called Reclaiming British Gujarati Hindu Culture After Conversion to Evangelical Christianity. So in my research, it was an ethnography, but it was also an auto-ethnography, in that there was part of my own story that's interwoven into my thesis. Let's go to the next slide. So West and Turner talk about different ways to resist being unmuted. And I'm going to read for you now an excerpt from my thesis. Raksha and I are in her rented upper room floors of a semi-detached house in North London. We are both in the kitchen when our eyes are drawn to the street below. We lean over the sink to get a better view. Cars are arriving. First, we see women pour out into the street, dressed in beautiful saris, then little girls in bright shalwar kameez or lenga, men in fine suits or traditional sherwani or kurta paired with designer jeans. We peer out of the window further, then look at each other. Raksha is wearing mismatched fluffy pajamas, and I'm in my husband's oversized grey t-shirt that bears the words, every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. Diwali morning, and here we are alone, far from our family, unfamiliar with our mother tongue, and somewhat deracinated. Back to the bustle outside, people greet one another. Some are carrying packages of gumla and the different types of sweets for Diwali. An older woman adjusts the sari of a younger. The teenage girls huddle together and look at each other's saris. They adjust a pleat here, stretching their hands through the flowing piece of fabric over the shoulder. Teenage boys step back and allow the elders to pass by into the house first. Selfies are clicked, cheeks are pinched, kisses are shared as babies are passed from hip to hip. As some disappear into the house, others arrive, and the scene continues. We look again and we point out various colours and styles of clothing. Slowly, the crowd outside, oblivious of our voyeurism, vanishes into the house. We take a couple of gumdra from the fridge and heat them up in the microwave. As British Gujarati Christian converts, this was as close as we might ever get to celebrating Diwali. So coming from a Hindu background, when I became a Christian, like all the other Gujaratis, we discontinued contact with our people group. And this was considered a show of our commitment to evangelical Christianity. So in a way, this was me naming it the silencing. This was the first time that I had ever expressed what it was like to be a convert. Because when we go to church and we share our testimony, it's like an infomercial. I used to be that, but now I'm this. I was a terrible sinner, stuck in heathen tradition, but now I'm this. But what happens is that so much of our culture and so much of who we are, not what we were, but who we are, is muted in the conversion experience. So some churches have made attempts to give voice to our cultural expression. And I had this experience during my research to experience what was known as a Yeshu satsang. So Yeshu, you can imagine, is the word Jesus, and satsang means worship. So it was a Jesus worship celebration. And it was held at a local church in London. And it was in 2016. And I was in the middle of my research, and this was part of my data gathering. And I attended this event, not just as part of my research, but also to see what it would be like to have this idea of being given a voice, having a cultural experience, a Hindu cultural experience within the church setting. So part of the change in religious beliefs, for those of us who come from traditions outside of Christendom, have a deep connection to the British historical mission dating back to the William Carey era of the 18th century. The characterization of people from the former colonies still today, I believe, continues to carry some of the elements of the label heathen. The majority world cultures, belief systems, and traditions have lingering images of somewhat savage practices compared to Western Christianity in Europe. So individual conversion stories from those of other faith backgrounds are often only included as exciting presentations in the evangelical church tradition of sharing testimony. And this expectation is valuable to provide a contrast, not just to validate the gospel, but the intrinsic superiority of the dominant culture of Western forms of evangelical Christianity. So the template of pre- and post-conversion narratives is set by the dominant group's characterization based upon their perspective of upholding and affirming Bebington's quadrilateral. And the dominant power model includes the use of English as a replacement for all religious expression, the exclusion of relationships with friends and family and individuals and networks of our relationships that are not open to the discussions of conversion, the discontinuation of traditional dress and celebration of events based on the Western interpretation and affirmation of evangelical Christian practices, and the disassociation of converts from any locations where icons or artifacts that are considered idolatrous by Western evangelical interpretation. So there's been a number of attempts by Western evangelicals to implement the idea of contextual Christian practices. Some of you may be familiar with the C1, C6 model by John Travis in 1998, which influenced several similar attempts to create programs for ministry leaders and church planters that begin to understand and appreciate the cultural practices of majority world converts, Christians, but presented through a translation of discipleship materials, hymns, and songs in multiple languages. So while many churches acknowledge the presence of majority world Christians in their community by occasional use of a foreign song or a foreign food in their church events, they also do things like this Yeshua Satsang celebration. So I'd like to read for you now part of my experience when I attended this Yeshua Satsang celebration. Three of the groups, and by the way, these excerpts that I'm reading are directly the data from my research for my PhD. So three of the groups involved in executing the event were churches interested in conversion and discipleship of British Gujarati to evangelical Christianity. Two groups were South Asian Christian groups that had an interest in converts' religio-cultural practices and the interaction between their communities as well as British Gujarati Christians and the conversion of Hindus in Britain and in India. The third group was from a Bible college that specialized in training evangelical Christians for British Evangelical Church and foreign mission vocations. At the event, there were walkthrough displays of Bible scenes using Indian artifacts, but nothing to be connected with Hindu religious practices. There are a few Indian snacks and sweets and some soft drinks. There are no families or children there. The presentations are in English without the use of translators except during the Bible readings. This feels like a church service, but aimed at kids. We're sitting on the floor. There may be 80 people present. They all seem to know each other. All British Gujarati Christian and British Evangelical Christians. I met 3 people who were British Gujarati Hindus that came with their British Gujarati Christian friends. The music is performed by an indigenous British singer trying to sing in Hindi with such heavy English accents that rendered the lyrics untranslatable for the native speakers of Gujarati and Hindi. Using a projector, an image of Jesus is displayed. The music leader is telling us to focus on this picture of a man. He has Western white Caucasian features in modern art form, and he's colored in blue, yellow, green, and orange blocks. Now, the strange thing about this celebration is all the Gujarati that attended were very, very polite. and thankful. But in actual fact, this was not a Diwali celebration. This was supposed to take the place of what I had witnessed from the window when I saw Gujarati people celebrating Diwali. And what the church was telling me was, this takes its place for you. And the British Gujarati people that were there accepted it. So this is considered contextual Christian practice. But my question is, whose context and for whose benefit? Because it certainly wasn't for mine. It certainly didn't do anything to make me feel that I was celebrating Diwali. And the sad thing is if we say something, we're being ungrateful. So as a subordinate group, we have to accept this expression of ourselves. So this is what I mean by naming the silencing. This was considered giving voice to my culture. And my question is this, is if evangelical Christians, Western evangelical Christians, or even Indian evangelical Christians are giving me a voice, who gives you yours? Who gives you yours? And do I need you to give me a voice? Or can I use my own? Can I use my own? Because according to the theology that we preach, as a convert, I am as equal as any other person in that place. So how does this work? How does unmuting work within the evangelical context? Let's move to the next slide. As I got to the end of my research, the place where I did my ethnographic research, it just so happened that they had, this is 3 years later than the event that I just spoke about, they had their own celebration. This was October of 2021, by which time I had completed my research and I was sitting in Oxford. And I will read now my final part of my data collection from my field notes. This is October 2021. I stare at my computer and prepare for a Zoom gathering at the London church. I was accustomed to Gujarati, Hindi, and English as the routine of the church service. The small hall seems unusually crowded. As I try to spot Raksha, I see different faces, women in colourful saris, looking for friends and saving seats. Giggling girls of all ages, some in pretty party dresses or sparkly shalwar kameez, such lovely lehenga. Young men dressed in jeans or khaki pants and a baseball hat paired with kurta or a sports t-shirt. As the crowd settle down and the announcements are made in this British Gujarati Christian church, I realise it is Diwali morning. The unstable internet connection blurs the faces of individuals, so it is hard to differentiate between Raksha, Rani, Mohan, Veena, my custom British Gujarati Christian family and friends that I have made since beginning my research. A young woman I recognise from my field visits stands up and shares the story of Diwali. Ram travelled through many dangerous places to rescue his wife Sita, who had been kidnapped by an evil king. After defeating the king, the people set the diva, little lamps, outside their homes to light the way back for the heroic couple. Light overcomes the darkness and shows us the way. Jesus is our light. Someone has made a beautiful rangoli, a beautiful colourful piece of art used to decorate the floor at the entrance of a building during celebrations. Templates are used and heavily dusted with vibrantly coloured powder. A new template creates another design in a different colour. Layer after layer of templates and colours create unique design, and despite their breathtaking beauty, will eventually be smudged by trampling feet and washed away in the next rainfall. As the presentations end, the chairs are moved back and some people disappear to prepare for the shared meal. Everyone else prepares for Garba, the traditional dance of Diwali. The electric keyboard strikes a chord and Sunita Durji takes the handheld microphone and begins the call and repeat of Prabhu Yeshu Bhajan, our Yeshua Satsang. So in this, you can see that there is the one attempt, this one, of somebody giving voice, and the second attempt of us reclaiming, elevating, and celebrating our subordinate root culture. Now, let's go back to Bebington's quadrilateral. You can see that there's a square there. The square contains conversionism, activism, biblicism, and crucicentrism. And when we see people come to faith, we want to pull them into the center of that square. But what if that square was inverted? You still have conversionism, activism, and biblicism as the center, but the walls are gone. Instead, we're pulling people inwards. They're all coming inwards. Instead of being squeezed into a box, they come to the center in their way. So we still have those beliefs, but culture isn't forced into a box that can't contain it. So finally, the purpose of using muted group theory in evangelical Christian context is not to identify victims and perpetrators and therefore mute any attempts at collaboration. The application of muted group theory in the development of evangelical Christian social spaces is to open discourse. It's an attempt to pursue ongoing involvement between and amongst groups to resolve power disparities that lead to marginalization. I'm sorry, my presentation went on a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope that it was clear. Thanks very much.
And let's see, can you stop share? Or
Yeah. Oops.
yeah, it's going to be options.
There we are.
There we go. And so we're going to go to here. There we go. Now we're going to do that magic moment where you're unmuted. And I have all power on the mouse. Just to let you know. But if you want to make a comment or question on the bottom of the screen, there's a little button called reactions. And if you click on that, then there is a little bar that says raise hand. So I'm going to do that right now to show you what that looks like. So you see how my raise hand, and we'll just go through the questions that way in terms of answering questions and just going through the group. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. And I see one here in the room. Click on the button, Damon.
Raise this physical hand.
Okay, Damon, go ahead and answer the question. And for you who are online, just raise your hand, and I see that Jeremiah's raised it, so you'll be next after Dave.
So, I mean, the question that you raised, a very important question. And I, as a Chinese Christian, also face this kind of questions. Many years ago, I think around about 2005, I did something extraordinary in the Navy. I don't know whether any one of you were present, and Billy Samuel was the director then. So I got his permission. I would bring in a Chinese lion and do a Chinese lion dance in the Navy. And I would play the drum. The drum is very big. There are people, you know, there are two people playing the front of the lion and the back of the lion. There are other instruments, and I play the drum. And I convert the lion dance into a worship, an act of worship based on Isaiah 11, the lion with the lamb. And very interestingly, in the Chinese lion dance, the lion eats vegetable, lettuce. So I mean, it can be contextualized. So I contextualized it, and it was well received. There was no problem. But I wouldn't dare to do that in a Chinese church. If I do that in the church, I might be excommunicated, because that lion dance originally has a connotation with, flirtation with the spirit, whatever. I completely removed that by using Isaiah 11. I took the form and put in new meaning, really. It was a very enjoyable time. So now the question is that we are Christian, yes? So Christ is at the center. So the question is, how do we contextualize Christ in the context of Diwali? What are the good ways and what are the bad ways of contextualizing Christ, our gospel, in that specific context? And sometimes you will be accepted by the Indian Christian themselves. Sometimes you will be rejected, and there's a danger.
Yeah.
So for me, I dare not do that in church. I dare to do it here.
Yeah.
So if you do something simple in you might be kicked out. So
Yeah, very true. Actually, that's a very good point, Damon. And I'll tell you this: that if I go into an Indian Christian church with a bindi on, the Christians there find it very difficult. Now, if an English person went into that place, let's say Anne went in there with a bindi on, they would accept it. Because actually, whether we believe it or not, we still look at power from the West and the white voice as being stronger than any of our cultural contexts. The Indian church may not accept it, but they would accept it more than they would accept it from me. So oftentimes what we have to do with these contextual practices is get our white brothers and sisters on our side and help us to take it to our own people. Because our own people still look at the voice from the West as more important than my voice. It's just a fact of life. But these are aspects of the influence of Western culture on Christianity that we cannot pretend that filter will ever go away completely. How we choose to engage with it is a different matter altogether. So yes, we can use Diwali because unlike Islam or Christianity, Hindu theology is not based on a book. And Hindu theology is created, and especially with Gujarati people, because the migration is such a massive part of their expression of their religious their religious practices that change in migration. They would be willing to include this. But the worry is, for many of us that have converted, is that how do you know that they're not still pretending to be Hindu? Right?
Yeah.
That's why the cross is more important than the square. They will gradually come in. But if we make a solid boundary, we're leaving people out.
Okay, well, let's go to Jeremiah. Go ahead and unmute your microphone, Jeremiah, and make your comment or question.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so glad to be part of this. I want to commend Usha. I hope I pronounced your name very well. Usha, you've done tremendously well. I'm so excited to listen to you with the enthusiasm with which you have presented your work. And of course, I just want to raise some question of clarification so that I'll be sure I'm hearing you clearly. Of course, I seem to be hearing something on integration, identity, Christian identity. Yes, being Christian and be what you are within your community, within not being suppressed by another cultural group. Of course, you've identified issues that needs to do with British evangelicals. I want to also say that within our context here in Nigeria, it's not only limited to British evangelicals. We've also seen Christians from other communities looking down or not accepting the other. So for me, it's a very big issue. It's a very serious problem that we need to address, especially when Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 says that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male or female, for we are all one in Christ. We have been set free in Christ. And so, but we still discover that we have this disparity, of course. So you said something about creating discourse, dialogue, resolving our disparities that leads to marginalization. For me, this is great. This is something that we need to look into as Christians, born-again Christians, evangelical Christians. Once we have accepted Christ, there shouldn't be disparity. There shouldn't be I am black or I'm white, you are green, or you are coming from a particular social group. Or so for me, it comes out quite clear. I want to really be sure I'm hearing you clearly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for your comment.
David, sing.
Well, as you were speaking, which I was thinking of Narayan Vaman Tilak, probably know him from Maharashtra in Western India, and how the Presbyterian mission in that part of India forbade him to experiment with his ideas on Yesu Darbar, which means the court of Jesus, and he died with it without having an opportunity really to experiment this idea among Christians in this part of the world. And now the same idea has been revived by Schwartz in Allahabad, and the results have been wonderful, because we see almost every week thousands and thousands of people from different villages around Allahabad congregating in this location and receiving Christ and praying in the name of Jesus Christ. So I see examples of exactly what you're saying, also from India, examples like him, and also Sadhu Sundar Singh. But all men and women in their own camps or groups are not the same. I'm just wondering if you have come across any sort of criticisms of muted group theory that you would like to highlight, because not all theories cover all bases. There are obviously problems with theories, and sometimes they hide more than they illuminate. So I'm just wondering if you can highlight for me some of the critiques that you've come across in your own reading of this theory.
Yeah, I mean, one of the criticisms of the theories is that it's too subjective. But then I think part of that problem is that the idea of hierarchy of authority is what's kept muted group theory going. It's what's kept people subordinate and dominant. So I think as we move into the future, and just the way I see, and this is just me personally seeing how our society is changing, we're looking at more ideas of polycentric leadership. And that means a blurring of structural lines, which, you know, you could argue is that then you're going to, you're going to corrupt the Bible. But in my opinion, is if we believe the Bible is God's word, that it is up to God to keep that at the forefront of our minds as well. And that as followers of Jesus, we shouldn't be afraid of any theory, and we should fully criticize every theory, including muted group theory. So I think the criticism would be for those who find the loosening or the pushing at the boundaries of structure difficult. Those would be the people who find. Most of our faith is in the blurry space. It's not in the black and white. It's in the blurry space of day to day. So, I mean, there's a lot of overlap with things like intersectionality and things, which I think Paul Woods is going to talk about next week. But I think those would be the criticism, that it's too subjective.
And don't you think it also tends to kind of totalize and place people in groups, and tends to suggest that somehow everyone in this or that behaves in the same way, which is not always true. So we kind of generalize about men and women, generalize about the so-called West and the rest of the world. And there are diversities in each of these groups that we conceive of.
Yeah,
And-
the thing is, these groups are not separate, they're all overlapping.
Mm,
So you're not just a part of one group,
right.
right? And so at the same time, so if you think about muted group theory just in the way that we've discussed it here today, as you interact with your other groups, part of this goes into that, right? So there's no completely isolate, and that's more and more noticeable in the days of technology, that groups are not isolated. They're just social groups. Our social groups and our networks of groups are overlapping so quickly that it's far more fluid than it is a rigid structure.
Well, that's illustrated so well also in your own person. Somebody who comes from India, was born in this culture. You kind of manifest this third space in ways that most other people don't. And so you have the rare privilege of occupying this third space that many of us don't have an experience of.
Well, you're welcome to join me.
We'll start the third space church. Marjorie, go ahead and unmute and ask your question or comment.
Okay, yeah. Hey, Usha. Thanks so much for your presentation. I felt like you presented the problem very eloquently and just really explained it very, very well about what is muted group theory and all of that. I guess my question is in your research, and I don't know if you did this or not, did you uncover or find specific strategies to help unmute the muted voices? And for me, because right now I am in India, and I deal a lot with Christian organizations in the church, and being a woman, I just feel like it's almost an insurmountable mountain, and I'm looking for hope. Where is the hope that there will be, that the people's voices, regardless of race, gender, creed, or whatever, will be listened to? And so I'm just wondering, in your research, what hope you found, what strategies you found to unmute these muted voices.
That's a really good question, Marjorie, and that's part of what this book will be about. So when I, in the slide presentation, I offered Weston Turner 2017 as 4 ways of resisting muting. One was naming the silencing, which is what I believe I did when I explained how that church tried to do this contextual approach to the Diwali celebration. The second one was to reclaim, elevate, and celebrate subordinate group culture. And this is by themselves. So that was the second illustration that I gave of the Diwali celebration that was held at the British Gujarati Church in London. The third and the fourth ones that I didn't get to, they suggest creating new words that are inclusive and also using media platforms. And I think using media platforms is very important, because in the church, we've got this idea that we can only talk about what we agree with, right? So we have platforms, whether it be through blog spots, lectures, theses, presentations, church services. We need to make the most of those. And there is a kind of a strange mutedness in white people as well. They all have this pressure on them to always have the answers. And that mutes them, because then they won't do anything. So there are white people who are caught in muted group theory and just in themselves a sort of a knot that can't be unmuted. And part of your thesis, Marjorie, is your voice in unmuting not just the people that you're researching, but yourself in your interaction with these groups. So yes, there is hope. And we must use the platforms available, and we must not be afraid to talk about the hard things. As far as the prize, we can't avoid the hard thing. We're supposed to be a body. Let me tell you something. Don't like to use this image, but it'll stick with you. When I take a shower, I wash the parts of me you can't see. And that's how we have to be as Christians as well. We have to pay attention to the parts that seem hard to understand and hard to talk about.
Okay, let's go with Lavino. Go ahead and mute Lavino and ask your question and make your comment.
Hi, Usha.
Hi.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed your presentation, and I was looking forward to this very much, and I ended up inviting two of my friends too, and I'm happy that they're here. My question is very similar to Marjorie. I'll just go ahead and ask because I want to be a little more specific. So there's a saying that says you need to learn the rules first in order to break them. So I find that in reading a little bit about muted group theory, I remember, if you remember, you recommended the theory to me for my thesis as well. So you need to learn the language of the dominant groups first in order to be able to find a voice. I think that's somewhere that's what the theory says. And if I look around in my own context, personalities who have been educated in universities, and usually the reputed ones are, designed after Western models of education. They are more respected. Their voice is received better than those who don't have the privilege to be educated in those kind of universities. And I could not digest that last slide before you took it down. I could not read that in full, but so very similar to what Marjorie asked, what does finding a voice look like? But my specific question is about whether you agree with what this theory says, that you need to learn, or we are pressured to learn the language of the dominant groups first in order to find a voice. After you've done your research, what is your comment on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I find this with a lot of the students that come to OCMS. You'll often have students that'll come in and say, well, I've published this and I've published that and I've done this and I've done that. And what we want them to do, what you soon realize here at OCMS, is you have to draw a line under that, put it to one side while you do your research. And it's in your research that you're not, yes, you're engaging with the dominant power structure, but part of your remit as a researcher is to push against those structures. So where you might start from the position within the dominant camp, even as a subordinate, it's up to you to broaden the discourse. It's up to you to contribute. That's what an original contribution to knowledge is. It's taking that's already there, that dominant power, if you like, and stretching it out and forcing it to engage with issues that are yet unstated. So yeah, we have to start there. But we don't have to stay there.
Okay, Donna, will you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Usha. Thank you for that. That was so fascinating. So much of it resonates with different parts of my life and my husband's life and what we see. I suppose that what I wanted to ask and dig into is muted group theory is coming, and it's tallying up with the post-structuralist worldview and realizing coming with a hermeneutic of suspicion as to how meaning is made and how we make understanding in terms of social power dynamics. And I think that there is a lot of this growing. What I would really like to see, and because we're talking about evangelicalism here, I think is helping the church reclaim its ecclesiology, which I think evangelicalism has lost in its heavily dominant focus on soteriology and conversionism. And muted group theory is it's coming from this angle, and it's building up and it's reshaping here in practice at the end. But I really don't see within evangelicalism, and I work for Evangelical Alliance with evangelical churches all the time, every day at grassroots in the West. our social imaginary of what church is so lacking of a biblical understanding that we are united to one another across social power dynamics in Christ. And that has been completely lost from my experience of evangelicalism. And I'm just wondering, you know, how do we do muted group theory and elevating voices and resisting here, but also reframing and rerouting into what it really means to be church, the reconciled community across social identities and cultures and race?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think one of the ways, especially in Britain, that we're seeing those challenges met is the fact that the fastest growing churches in this country are because of African migrants and reverse mission. And once we accept that and we engage with those thoughts, and in my opinion, this is in my opinion, if you are doing any work with the evangelical church in this country, you should do a course on African theology. And so once we understand that we don't just have to look at theology, evangelical theology from one perspective, and we not only just hear other perspectives, but are prepared to engage the two together, there's a mutual unmuting that goes on. And it can only be a good thing, because God's not trapped in one culture. Our expression, we have forced it into a culture because it suits us to be able to do things quickly. So I think that's part of the unmuting process, is to own that we've got it wrong in terms of a hierarchy of one theology being at the top, and opening up that theology is still happening, it's still occurring. Does that help, Donna?
Yes, I still think we're sitting here, and I'm really interested in how evangelicalism is really going to regain their ecclesiology right at the center of Salvation Church. And there, I think it's.
Oh, you're muted.
No, I was finished. I think it's a both and, you know.
Well, I look forward to hearing more from you as well, because your lecture is coming up soon. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to address some of these. This is an advert for future lectures, by the way.
Yes. All of you joining, please join the following lectures coming up. Shan, go ahead.
Thank you, Usha, for the presentation. That is really insightful. I'm still quite new in missiology, and so I hope my question makes sense. My ministry context is among Muslim refugees in Germany. So what I find is the cultural difference between Germany and Middle East is quite a hurdle for many local churches to engage in evangelism. And on the other hand, Muslim background believers have this pressure to integrate to the dominant German culture, which is mostly influenced by, I think, Kantian philosophy and postmodern philosophy. And so my question is, how can the local churches give voice to the MBBs, and how should Muslim background believers also deal with these, the Enlightenment philosophy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm glad you're doing what you're doing in Germany. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that, especially because of my role with Lausanne. I spent 10 years in a Muslim majority country, and I'm an Arabic speaker. And I've spent time speaking to not just Hindu background Christians here in this country, but Muslim background Christians. Now, the difference with the Muslim background Christians in this country, especially if they're those that have been born here, they're actually quite bold to speak up. And oftentimes there'll be a group of leaders, white leaders in this country, who will develop a program for reaching Muslims, and they want to teach the Muslim background believers. So they're still not in a position, they feel that their expertise, instead of going to the Muslim background believer and saying, why don't you teach us? They're still saying, we want to teach you. So it's expecting the local church to stop and listen. If there are Muslim background believers amongst you, listen to them before they sound like you. It's really important. Even if some of the things that they do seem basic and not like the things that the German church does or the British church does, rather than be in a hurry to check off the boxes to get that Bebington's quadrilateral as a template, listen. Listen to what the Muslim background believers are doing. I often find in this country, when I go to events, and I think Peter or Yogi and I have been in this situation, that we'll be at an event and they'll have a majority world expression somewhere. But at the end of the evening, when we get together and we speak by ourselves, we speak more openly and honestly and more daringly because we're tired of being pushed aside in a large group. And I think you'll find that with your MBB believers, that left to their own devices, if what they feel and think can be expressed and recorded for themselves, it will be far more useful to the church in Germany than putting so much money into new programs to disciple somebody that really should be discipling you.
Good, thank you.
Riyadh, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really fascinating. And I saw that you mentioned Egypt. You have been in Egypt, and I'm coming from a Coptic background from Egypt, so I can relate with what you said. My question would seem a bit naive, but I have some sub question to this question. And my question is, what do you think are the real roots for creating a dominant group, not creating a muted group, for creating a dominant group in this theory? In a sense, because I always fear that the muted group, when they become unmuted, the only model they have is the dominant group. So after a while, in a different context, they will become a dominant group again, and we have the same problem repeating again and again. So how do you think, before naming the silence, the roots of the silence, what created the dominant group to be a dominant group, also knowing that it's a Christian context, so there are good intentions are all there, and all for the glory of God in a sense. So how do you think are the roots of that kind of creating and recreating a dominant group?
It's a really good question. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about me. I'm married to a white American man. So there's a constant battle with dominant group theory just in our house, right? Just so that you know. And also we visited Egypt. If I've got time, I have to share my Egypt story with you sometime. But the idea is that the dominant group theory, the dominant model, isn't just found in the church. That dominant power is outside of the church. So let's say, while we're in this lecture, we all agree that there's dominant power structures. We all agree that things need to be evened up. The minute we get out of here, we switch this off, just opening up YouTube or Facebook, without even knowing it, we are immediately having the dominant group theory reinforced. And it can be so subtle. Riyadh, I'll tell you my experience when I went to Egypt. It was the afternoon. I was in a part called Madi something or other. And I speak a little bit of Arabic. And I went into a small dukan, a small shop. And I'm thinking like a Westerner, that you just go help yourself and pick up your things and put them in your basket. And so I'm looking around and I just need one or two things. And this old man with no teeth and his hat on, and he comes up to me and he says, "Biddik Aish." And I thought, okay, Biddik means do you want? Aish, that's related to life. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's he saying to me? So I just carried on, pretended not to hear him. And I picked up some jam, which I didn't need. And I picked up one or two other items, so I don't know where to go. And it's the afternoon and people are sleeping. There's not very many people about. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this Egyptian Muslim man, he's asking me if I want to live. He's asking me if I want to live. And he comes up to me again and he says it again really loud, because everyone knows when you don't speak the language, you're speaking to a foreigner. If you say it in your own language really loud, that translates into the foreign language, right? So he says it to me again, really loud, "Biddik Aish." And by this time, I'm getting really scared. I'm backing up against the corner. This is a Muslim man. I'm a Westerner. He's going to kill me for sure. Because we all know that Muslims are terrorists, right? And I looked at him in the face and I said, Naam biddi, which means, yes, yes, I want to live. And he handed me a piece of bread. Because in Egyptian Arabic, the word for bread is not khubz, it's not pita, it's aish. So you see, even though I was thinking of myself, I'm open to subordinate groups. I don't look at dominance and support. I realized how much dominant group theory had a hold on me and the way I looked at other people. So, but if we don't have these discussions ongoing, it's like people say, we've done enough of repentance over racism. No, 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 my friends. We have to continue having these conversations, because once these lights are switched off and we leave, the influence from out there is so strong that it will reinforce those dominant structures immediately.
So just to follow up, so what you mean is that it's embedded in our fallen nature in a sense.
Yes.
This is
Yes.
this is the norm, but the Christian way is to stop it.
And to push against it is to deliberately push against it.
Thank you. Thank you, very helpful.
Trixania, please unmute and ask your question.
Oh,
First of all, thank you so much, Usha. So lovely to listen to you. And then, of course, I resonate so much with what you're sharing for myself in an African context, and more so as we integrate into sort of global spaces as well. And yeah, I appreciate also, and I like that, you know, the whole purpose of you using muted group theory is to create discourse. And I guess the question that I have is, just in your journey of research, can you sort of describe the level of consciousness in terms of the dominant group for the need to listen and to be aware? That is my question. But I actually, before the question, I just wanted to make a comment. I do appreciate that you highlighted also the tension within the two different groups, as it were. Because there's obviously, we talked a lot about the dominant group, but then there's also this tension of either there is a awareness or a confidence to celebrate authenticity within muted groups, but at the same time, there is so often people with a minority voice, they are so programmed by what they perceive is the right way. So I like that you also address, because I think that area in particular also needs attention within minority voices. But the question, level of consciousness in your journey of the dominant group in terms of the need for us to have this sort of discourse.
that's a great question, Trixania, and I'm really thrilled that you're here with us today. Trixania will be hopefully preparing a chapter with me on colorism in muted group theory. So I'm really looking forward to spending more time with her. But you can see, when the camera pans out, you can see this room. And this room is where I sat when I did my induction score for my PhD. And I remember sitting with my back against this door right here. And I was the only woman, and there were 10 other men. And if you could see facing outward, where I look out to is the main nave. And I would see a woman called Rachel walking across. And every time I saw her, I was terrified that she was coming to tell me that I should have been rejected from the program and that I had to leave the class immediately. That's how strong that dominant group theory, that dominant group power was inside of me. That's how strong it was. And even though when I sort of say, oh yeah, I'm writing about being unmuted, everyone in this place, and most of you that know me would say, Usha, you don't mean unmuted. You know, you're speaking up for many people combined. But what is internal with subordinates and dominants is something that needs to be spoken out loud. Because then it can be addressed and dismantled. And the only way that we can push against these things is to keep getting together and talking and addressing. Every time there are issues with racism, every time something happens and the media springs up, it is the Christians. It is the Christians who owe it to each other and the world to speak out the ugly things and address them.
We'll go with Anne.
Okay, so Usha, thank you very much. I've got something to say that's an example that reflects something of what you are saying as a white woman, and then a question.
Okay.
I was very struck by what you said about naming the silence, because often we don't use them. And this was brought home to me recently when I was at a conference hearing the story of the road to Emmaus, which is one of my favorite stories. The road to Emmaus is where people talk, they come together, Jesus shows up, and new meaning is created and seen. For me, the image of the Botticelli, two men and Jesus, has been one of my favorites. This conference, somebody stood up and said, did you know there is reason to believe that the two disciples were a married couple?
Oh, wow.
And I thought, I had never thought of that before, because all my life, I have the Botticelli image in my mind, and it's men. And as soon as you said that, I thought, of course, it could be a married couple. They go home, they cook tea together, they invite Jesus in. But what I hadn't realized was the meaning changed significantly when it was a married couple, because instead of being an outsider looking in, I was an insider experiencing Jesus myself as a woman.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that I had been silenced in that story until somebody said,
yeah,
it could be a married person, a married couple, right? Which I think for me just highlights how important that is to naming the silence, because most of the time we don't see it.
Yeah.
So my question linked to this is a little bit tied in with something Donna said about the evangelical response to this, and also something that Lavina said about in order to know the rules, you need to know how to break them. You've talked about an evangelical expression of this. Do you think this is the same problem within the Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition, or have they found a different way to navigate this? I don't know whether you've considered it. I just asked the question.
Yeah, I have considered it, but to be honest, I've had to limit because of the way I want to write this book. I don't want to write this book from other people's writings. I want to write them from my interaction with other people who are rooted right now. And I believe that, yes, there's room for unmuting in every area. I have looked at it specifically from the evangelical perspective, because that's the one that I know, and that's the one that I'm engaged with. But we can apply this theory to so many different things in so many different ways. And initially, when I used it in the evangelical arena, was during Lausanne Europe 2021. And at the time, when I was asked to join the leadership team, they had a meeting in Amsterdam for 80 of Europe's Christian leaders. And they invited 5 migrants because they were so happy that they were including migrants in the conversation. And Peter and I were there, and there were 5 migrants there, and we all knew each other. And that was the extent of the European evangelical Lausanne contacts with migrants, right? So the idea of majority world diaspora was brought into Lausanne. But when it came to talking about it and presenting a paper, I couldn't talk about Black Lives Matter because from America, the evangelicals already decided that that was not allowed, not that it wasn't allowed for us, but it was not allowed because it was linked to Marxism. Yet I knew we all needed to talk about race. But if I'd have said, we're going to have a talk on race, more than half the people would have left because none of us is racist and none of us is sexist. So I had to use muted Greek theory so I could bring people in increments to talk about things that were uncomfortable. And so, yes, other groups can be unmuted. And yes, there's an absolute way for this to be used in Catholicism, in other branches of Christianity, in other discussions, not just in academia, not just in practical theology, in all sorts of different ways. But I will limit mine to this, for this particular book and this particular stage of my writing. So, yeah.
David, you had your hand up, and this will be the last question, and after this, then we'll close.
Tim.
Oh, Tim, you got one too?
I won't
Okay,
ask.
then,
I won't ask.
go ahead, Tim.
Well, two things, both quite small. One is that your little kind of square and then the cross, as it were, and everything coming to the centre. It reminded me very much of an essay by Paul Hebert on set theory, mathematical set theory, as a model for understanding the church. And he's quite anti the idea of a bounded set, where you're either in or out. And he had a centered set, and I thought it's very, very similar to your idea. But then, well, and people can read that up if they want. The other thing is that it's word dominant and so forth. In my church, he's dead now, but there was an extremely daunting personality. He'd been a colonial officer in Kenya, and I was scared of him, genuinely scared of him. I was a home group leader, and the home groups got split up into cluster groups. And the cluster group leader that I had was this guy. And I was terrified of him. And he asked me what I was going to do about this, that, and the other. And I was explaining the options. And he said, well, what are you going to do? And I was begging him to tell me what to do because, you know, I was scared of him. And he wouldn't. He said, no, it's your group, you do it. And I began to realize the difference between daunting and domineering. And you know, so that's a challenge perhaps to us, that even if we're very daunting personalities, there's still an opportunity not to be domineering. And so that's a challenge to all of us, not to be domineering.
Especially for me, because that's an easy place for me to be at the moment, domineering. But I think about when the OCMS students come in, it's quite daunting because we're looking to the faculty to lead us. And what you all do, and you do well, is you pull away and make us find it out for ourselves. So that's actually, to me, one of the massive pluses of studying here at OCMS, is that you deliberately stop yourself from being domineering. And it's when we recognize that daunting is fleeting as we become more familiar.
He daunted me
Anyway, thank you, Tim.
Well, with that, thank you very much all for joining. And this is just the beginning of a whole series of lectures and a book. So next week, Paul Woods will be our next speaker. So let me encourage you to join again. I think that's very, very important. Usha, you really touched on something. One of the things that OCMS is all about is being unmuted. From its very origins, what this whole place was about was bringing to the fore voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and particularly from perspectives that had been muted, but needed to be unmuted. And so we're so glad that you joined this conversation, and we ask you to continue to join in the conversation that flows through this building, but so many institutions now globally, where voices that were previously muted are now unmuted, and being able to speak out and speak truth to power. So in that, thank you so much, Usha, for starting this out in such an excellent way. Let's just put our hands together and thank you. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And so with that, I will bid adieu.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.